Let's jump right into an incredibly important, though definitely sensitive topic today. We're going to break down a recent study from the Journal of Sex Research, and honestly, it completely challenges a lot of the standard assumptions we have about neurodivergence and vulnerability. It's heavy stuff for sure, but understanding what the data actually says is absolutely crucial if we want to protect people.
So the really vital question researchers Brianna M. Akers and Zoe D. Peterson wanted to answer was simply this. Does an autism diagnosis actually change someone's risk of sexual victimization? What they found is fascinating, because the data actually shifts our entire focus away from a simple diagnostic label and points us directly towards specific sensory experiences.
To unpack this explainer clearly, here's our roadmap. We'll start with uncovering a hidden risk, break down the research, look at what the data reveals, go beyond a formal diagnosis, explore the role of sensory overload, and finally, talk about creating safer communities.
Now, before we look at a single number, there is a crucial baseline we have to establish. Lead researcher Brianna M. Akers stated it beautifully. Autism does not cause victimization. Non-consensual sexual experiences are literally never the fault of the survivor. That responsibility always 100% lies entirely with the person who enacts the harm. Let's keep that firmly in mind as we dive into the data.
Section 1. Uncovering a hidden risk and looking at the core question.
You see, there's been this massive gap in our knowledge. We already knew from existing research that autistic individuals are disproportionately affected by non-consensual sexual experiences. But the glaring unknown was the specific types of experiences. The researchers wanted to identify these distinct vulnerabilities. Why? Because knowing the exact tactics being used is exactly what we need to actually inform advocacy efforts and survivor services.
Moving on to Section 2. Breaking down the research methodology.
To get to the bottom of this, the scientists really structured their investigation meticulously. They used a 20-minute online survey to grab data from 663 adults in the U.S., and they carefully divided them into 3 distinct groups. They had 287 individuals with a formal clinical autism diagnosis, 270 with no diagnosis at all, and a really interesting third exploratory group. This was 106 individuals who suspected they had autism but lacked a formal diagnosis, the subclinical group. Now, to measure this risk accurately, instead of just vaguely asking about victimization, they used a revised questionnaire that breaks unwanted experiences into 4 distinct categories. First, you have non-contact, like verbal harassment or exposure. Then tech-facilitated, like getting unwanted images. Next are illegal acts involving physical force, threats, or intoxication. And finally, verbal pressure, meaning coercion and manipulation. By splitting it up like this, the researchers could pinpoint the exact tactics perpetrators were using against different groups.
Section 3. What the data reveals and the nuanced findings.
Okay, the data reveals a pretty stark comparison here. Autistic participants were indeed more likely to report certain types of experiences. Specifically, non-contact experiences, like being stared at or catcalled, and illegal acts involving force. However, and this is key, they were just as likely as non-autistic participants to report tech-facilitated victimization or verbal pressure. So, what does this mean? It means we can't just assume autistic individuals are at higher risk for all forms of victimization equally. It's actually highly specific.
Before we move on, there is an overarching finding we definitely can't ignore. Across all 4 categories we just talked about, women were consistently at a higher risk of victimization than men, completely regardless of their diagnostic status. The data also show that being older tended to slightly increase the likelihood of experiencing illegal acts and verbal pressure.
Section 4. Beyond a formal diagnosis and into the subclinical group.
Remember that third group we talked about earlier, the subclinical group? Well, participants who simply suspected they were autistic, but had literally no formal diagnosis, reported victimization rates that were remarkably similar to those with a formal diagnosis. This is a huge finding. It's especially critical for groups that are historically underdiagnosed, like women. It strongly suggests that vulnerability extends way beyond a doctor's formal assessment or a piece of medical paper.
Section 5. The role of sensory overload. This is the real aha moment. So if the vulnerability isn't just about the formal label itself, what's actually driving it? Well, the researchers looked at a screening tool that participants took, and they homed right in on this specific trait: sensory reactivity. Basically, this is your physical response to external stimuli. Think about getting completely overwhelmed by loud noises, bright lights, or unexpected touch.
Crucially, a participant's score on this one specific trait was consistently associated with all 4 forms of sexual victimization.
Let's explore why that actually happens. Heightened sensory reactivity means that intense stimuli can trigger a temporary emotional and physical shutdown. Think about it. When someone is essentially paralyzed by sensory overload, they might be entirely unable to process risk cues. Their ability to assert boundaries is heavily impaired. They might even be physically unable to remove themselves from a threatening situation. And sadly, this physical and mental overload is exactly what perpetrators exploit.
Section 6. Creating safer communities and finding the path forward.
Now, to be fair to the science, we absolutely have to acknowledge the study limitations. Because the recruitment was done online, the sample likely overrepresents autistic individuals who have high verbal skills and reliable internet access. Also, the diagnoses were self-reported. They weren't verified by medical records. So there's a clear need for future research on folks with higher support needs. But even with these limitations, the core takeaway is incredibly strong.
So what do we actually do with this information? To move away from prevention programming that relies way too heavily on formal diagnoses, the researchers laid out some specific steps. Number 1, we need to develop inclusive, sensory-friendly sexual health education. And number 2, we have to make sure these resources are accessible to absolutely everyone, including those with subclinical traits. It's about protecting people based on how they actually experience the world, not just what's in their medical file.
Which leaves us with a massive question to ponder. How can we restructure our sexual health and consent education today to ensure it genuinely protects those who are most vulnerable to sensory overload? This study makes it abundantly clear that the answers lie in how we process the world around us. Let's take this vital research and use it to build everyday safety for neurodivergent folks in all of our communities. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope it sparks some new understanding for you today.